Happy Sunday, everybody. When I was on my mission in Honduras in 2002, around there, I saved a bunch of articles that I had found online before my mission that I wanted to read through. And I saved them all on, I don't think it was a floppy disk. I think I burned a CD, and I had all these files on it. And a lot of them were from apologists for the church. In particular, one of them was Jeff Lindsay, who had created this whole big website. In fact, it's still up. You can find it at jefflindsay.com/LDSFAQ. And he's got all these articles talking about, evidences that support the historicity of the Book of Mormon and responses to claims made against, the church and its doctrines. And I had saved all these thinking like, hey, I should read through those. And I spent a lot of time on my mission. In fact, I was in the office for about a year. I was the finance secretary. And so I had a lot of time, between meetings and office stuff. So I would read a lot. I read a lot on my mission. And in particular, I would read these articles from Jeff as well as others. And for me, it was a very insightful experience to learn from people who were making kind of rational explanations for various gospel principles. This was the first time I had encountered apologetics. I had only recently, before my mission, became interested in some of the deeper questions and answers and sifting through the nuance and the attacks made against our beliefs and then how to defend those, because I'm thinking, hey, I'm going on a mission, I should be able to do that. So this was a very interesting process for me, and it prompts this musing, because I've been getting pushback. Well, I've gotten pushback for years and years and years. I have a thick skin. I don't really care, but it causes me to periodically reflect. And over the months, I've seen various comments on different platforms where this podcast is, or DMs that people send me, where they think that my approach to these musings is insufficiently inspiring, that it's too focused on kind of critique and analysis. And so I was reflecting on that, and I remembered this quote. This quote is from Austin Fair, and he wrote it in, I believe it was 1966. And you've probably heard of this before. He says, "Though argument does not create conviction, the lack of it destroys belief. What seems to be proved may not be embraced, but what no one shows the ability to defend is quickly abandoned. Rational argument does not create belief, but it maintains a climate in which belief may flourish." I found that really powerful, right? What seems to be proved may not be embraced, but what no one shows the ability to defend is quickly abandoned. This idea, by the way, Farrer, when he wrote this, he was remarking about C.S. Lewis, who was a Christian apologist, kind of writing a defense of Christianity. And so that's who he had in mind when he's talking about, rational argument. It doesn't create belief, but it maintains a climate in which belief may flourish. And the primary reason why many of us are familiar with this quote is that Neil Maxwell latched onto this quickly and used it often. So the quote came out in 1966. The very next year, Elder Maxwell uses it in his book. Shortly after this was said, he used it in many, many talks, many of his books. For example, here's from his talk in 1971. He says that with such a great message, can we afford not to be articulate in our homes and wherever we are? Passivity and inarticulateness, probably butchered that, inarticulateness about this marvelous work and a wonder can diminish the faith of others. Being passive and being inarticulate about the gospel can diminish the faith of others. Here's how he put it in 1983, again talking about the defense, the ability to, just as Farrer talked about, right? What no one shows the ability to defend is quickly abandoned. So here's how Maxwell put it, 1983. "Science will not be able to prove or disprove Holy Writ. However, enough plausible evidence will still come forth to prevent scoffers from having a field day, but not enough to remove the requirement of faith." Now, I mentioned this word apologetics, and that was a weird word for me to encounter. I'd never really understood that before encountering it shortly before my mission. And Latter-day Saints, I feel like, don't really use that term necessarily often. Perhaps they feel like, are we apologizing for our beliefs? Shouldn't we be confident and bold in them? Let's not feel any level of discomfort or the need to apologize for our faith. But if you look at the origins of the word, the etymology of the Greek word apologia, where we get the word apologetics from, the definition of that word originally meant defense. It's not this modern definition of an apology, which is, regret and remorse. Apologia was defense, which makes sense why Ferrer, in his quote, is saying that what no one shows the ability to defend is quickly abandoned. It makes sense why Maxwell, sharing that quote very often, was talking about how faithful scholarship can be a source of defense, not necessarily offense. You're not going out and trying to convince everyone with these arguments of, oh, look, here's an evidence that Nephi and his family might have been traveling through here because they named the city a certain thing. Right? That's not necessarily going to convince anyone of the Book of Mormon, but it provides that baseline argument to show that there is a rational position in believing these things to be true, even though they do require an element of faith. Okay, so if apologia means defense, what are we defending the gospel against? This is something I think of back from my missionary days. I think over the last, 25 years, I think of doing this podcast, my efforts now, my calling, in my community. What are we defending against? And sure, there are external attacks, right? We're defending against the enemies of the gospel. We're defending against Satan's minions, fomenting people in the media or people of other religions, people who attack our faith, belittle our beliefs, these external attacks from others. Those have long existed. We can quantify them, right? Whether you're a Catholic or an evangelical or whatever, and they're trying to attack the credibility and the veracity of, say, the Book of Mormon or Joseph Smith, and so on and so forth. Again, these are quantifiable in the sense that they use all the same arguments. They've all been regurgitated. They think that they're novel, and yet they're not. So obviously there are external attacks. Well, as we a couple months back went through the war chapters, when talking about Captain Moroni, I was bringing up this concept of the internal dissolution of society, where you've got Amalickiah out getting ready to attack, but Amalickiah himself, like so many before and after, were dissenting Nephites. So really that was an internal problem that then provoked the Lamanites to come and attack them. But then they also had domestically the Kingmen kind of civil war going on, right? Almost this like secession or this conflict. And so sure, we need to defend ourselves against the external attacks, but there's also these internal problems. Doctrine and Covenants 38:29 says, "You know not the hearts of men in your own land." We're always thinking of external problems. The context of this verse says, "You hear of wars in faraway lands, but you know not the hearts of men in your own land." Right? So we can think about defending the gospel against its critics externally, but if we don't know the hearts of men in our own land, if we don't realize the internal problems and dissensions and conflict, that I think becomes a bigger part of the problem. We get members today who leave the church for myriad reasons, but one of the large ones is, I stumbled upon this history. I had never been taught this before. The church was hiding it. Why did no one ever, teach me about this? And these superficial testimonies that lack intellectual depth, right? Like think of your gospel doctrine class. How many people in that class study, and I mean actually study, not just read to, hey, let's get through Come Follow Me so, I can check the box. But how many people in your average gospel doctrine class would you say are actually studying the gospel? So I think of if we're defending, what are we defending against? Yes, there's the external threats. There's also internal ones. How and under what circumstances do we defend the gospel from members of the church? That becomes an awkward question, right? The wheat has to defend itself against the encroaching tares. They're both competing for the same soil and nutrients. right? And if the wheat doesn't defend itself, then the tares spread, the tares have been planted among them and will overtake the wheat. So the wheat has to defend itself against the encroaching tares. If you have come to the same conclusion as I have, that I've shared in a couple musings, and I've got a couple more planned down the road on this topic, that Joseph Smith is not actually the author of Section 132, that he did not teach and endorse polygamy or plural marriage or whatever you want to use, that this was something that others around him were doing and blaming him. If you believe, like me, that we should listen to Joseph and take him at his word rather than listen to his enemies and his critics, then perhaps we have to defend Joseph against fellow church members and official historian claims and church narratives that besmirch his name. I'm reminded, for example, when Moroni warned him. This is in Joseph Smith History, verse 33. Joseph says, the Moroni is an angel, he called me by name and said unto me that he was a messenger sent from the presence of God to me, and that his name was Moroni, and that God had a work for me to do, and that my name should be had for good and evil among all nations, kindreds, and tongues, and that it should be both good and evil spoken of among all people. You get today plenty of non-members, people who've never been members of the church, and they attack Joseph as a charlatan and a con man and a pedophile and all these things. And those are the same exact critiques made by disaffected members, the internal threat, people who leave the church. They realize, oh my gosh, Joseph did all these things, therefore none of it must be true. And so I find myself thinking, okay, if I'm defending the gospel and the restoration, then an element of that may be defending Joseph's good name. I grew up always thinking that quote from the angel Moroni was that those evil, anti-Mormons, those Lamanites, right? No, the problem is the internal people. It's us. It's people in our midst who then go foment the external narratives. And so it's this narrative that's been established and given credibility throughout our church that Joseph, in fact, was, marrying young girls and doing this secretly behind Emma's back and lying about it publicly and all these things. So defending Joseph, right? I thought that quote was about defending him, and the people who would have his name for evil would be just people outside of the church. And yet the official narrative within our church has his name, at least in part, in this kind of evil aspect. Some might call it that, right? Many who defend the position would say, well, no, it was this higher thing and God commanded it, and whatever God commands is right. Even though that came from a letter from John Bennett, and I talked about that in a past musing. That letter does not have a good chain of title whatsoever. It appears to be totally made up to attack Joseph. So again, whether you agree with me or not, it raises a potential circumstance of, okay, maybe defending the gospel is defending against people who have shaped narratives or come to conclusions that don't comport with things that actually happen. We have to defend against secret combinations, corruption in high places. I think of Ephesians 6, verse 12. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. I think history is clear, I think the scriptures are clear, that the greatest threats that we have to defend against are internal. I think that is one of the primary messages and lessons of the Book of Mormon. To not be distracted by wars in faraway lands and external threats, but to realize that the problem is among us. Here's a quote that it's been attributed to Cicero. I've never been able to verify that he actually said it, but the substance of it is relevant and I think is worth bringing up. A nation can survive its fools and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within. An enemy at the gates is less formidable, for he is known and carries his banner openly. But the traitor moves amongst those within the gate freely, his sly whispers rustling through all the alleys, heard in the very halls of government itself. For the traitor appears not as a traitor. He speaks in accents familiar to his victims, and he wears their face and their arguments. He appeals to the baseness that lies deep in the hearts of all men. He rots the soul of a nation. He works secretly and unknown in the night to undermine the pillars of the city. He infects the body politic so that it can no longer resist. A murderer is less to fear. So perhaps for these reasons, you can see why my musings, which are literally just that, my observations, my theories, my concerns, my questions, right? My musings tend to focus more on internal concerns I have and observations I have than on external ones. I think what limits our growth is us, not society writ large, not external concerns. I think we are our own greatest threat. And because I focus on these kind of internal issues, church culture, church history, church membership, church leadership, church whatever, not everyone likes that, which leads some of them to say, oh, your stuff is interesting but not inspiring. So getting back to that quote from Fair, my goal with this podcast, if I never stated it outright when I started it 2 or 3 years ago, is not to be one of the many uplifting podcasts that just give you that spiritual dopamine hit, right? Here's your feel-good testimony builder. Here's your, whatever. Those are great. They have their place. I'm not knocking them. Although I do find it funny how often in church we now hear people quoting podcasts. As a podcaster myself, I find that a little awkward, right? Oh, I was listening, and just in church today, I had someone do it. I was listening on this podcast and they said this message. Whatever, right? The point is, there are many faithful, uplifting sources out there that you can and ought to expose yourself and your family to. That's great. That's not my goal here. My goal is not to give you a little spiritual dopamine hit and tell you all is well in Zion, kind of keep the blinders on. Let's kind of keep moving forward based on our current perceptions. My goal is to challenge our understanding, to have us question a little bit whether we are on the straight and narrow. Why? Because time and again and again and again, we find throughout scriptures people assuming they were on the so-called straight and narrow, when in fact they were not. I want to be on the straight and narrow. I want to return to God's presence. I want to be fully committed to the gospel. But to do so, I want to question whether what I believe is correct, whether what I'm doing is right, whether what someone is teaching me is in fact from God, right? I want to be very careful and cautious in these things, curious, questioning from a faithful perspective, making rational arguments, right? My goal ultimately is a rational perspective, not just uplifting stuff, although it has its place, and I've done some musings on that. My goal is analysis, a rational perspective, and apologia, a defense. Not just against external people. I've done a couple musings about, external stuff, but most of my content is focused on internal issues, defending the gospel even from fellow members of the church, even from our church culture, even from potentially church leaders who themselves are imperfect and have made mistakes. And the, church has admitted that. Elder Uchtdorf talked about that a decade ago. Most recently, the church came out in the gospel essays saying, hey, church leaders are imperfect and have made mistakes. I think we need to do far better about really digging in and understanding how and when that happens. As I said, the scriptural record is abundantly clear. God's people decay. They spiritually decay over time. And I don't like that. I don't want to accept that as an inevitability, nor do I want to believe, and I don't believe, that somehow we're exempt from those trends. These are the latter days. This is the final dispensation. Things are just going to get better and better, not worse and worse, potentially, like we see throughout scriptural history. And therefore, because I don't believe that we're just going to automatically keep getting better, I want to call out our adoption, as President Hinckley said, of the slow stain of wickedness.
With so much of sophistry that is passed off as truth, with so much of deception concerning standards and values, with so much of allurement and enticement to take on the slow stain of the world, we have felt to warn and forewarn.
Been thinking of doing a book all about that topic. The slow stain of wickedness, time and again. He said that, by the way, in his introduction to releasing the Family Proclamation to the world. That people consistently take on the slow stain of the world. And throughout scriptures, we see that again and again, right? Most recently, we see it as well. We get people supporting, socialism, saying we should never apologize, be good global citizens, following the arm of flesh, being seduced by secret combinations, being content with mediocrity, being under condemnation and not doing anything about it. right? Again and again, God's people throughout the scriptures decay. Another point I want to raise here is that I think defense, when we're talking about apologetics and defending the gospel against its critics and its enemies, both internal and external, I think defense is relative. Everyone thinks that they're the good guy. Everyone thinks that that they are the hero in their own story. For example, the British during the Revolutionary War, they were defending the British Empire. They were defending its territories, its holdings against an uprising. They were defending loyalists in the colonies, right, who were being persecuted by these, rebellious sons of liberty. The British were defending the status quo, whereas the Patriots were defending their sovereignty against its abuse by this oppressive government. In the war between the states, right, the North was defending the Union, keeping the country intact. The Southerners were defending their sovereignty. Many obviously defending their political and economic institutions, but not all. Many people thought that the North was being totally aggressive and untoward and unwilling to allow the Southern states to secede and self-govern. Darth Vader and his team, right, were defending the empire from this rebel uprising. The rebels were defending freedom. Apologists, today will defend church truth claims, official narratives, right? And some critics are defending the gospel against what they see as deviations from it. Jesus criticized the establishment, the religious establishment at the time, to defend God's will, whereas the religious leaders were defending the system. They were defending the law of Moses. They were defending, everything that they had concocted. So again and again, we see that the defense is relative. It's all perception. And someone might look, I've been accused. I'll just speak personally and not generically here. I've been accused. Oh, Connor, you're on the pathway out. You're on the path to apostasy. Oh, I'm counting the days until, you leave the church, like all this kind of stuff. And look, this has been going for years, but more recently where I've been a bit more outspoken on a regular basis through this podcast. Or sometimes they'll say, oh, you're going to get excommunicated or whatever. It's a minority of people. I'm not worried about it. I have thick skin. I don't really care. But I bring it up to surface this point that this type of defense, defending the gospel from even fellow members of the church, from the people among us who are adopting the slow stain of wickedness, the people who think that they are defending the official narrative and defending the empire or whatever it is, right? I see myself and others like me defending the gospel, defending God's truths from anyone in any level of authority who have encouraged us or tolerated the deviation from that path. By no means am I perfect in staying on that path, right? I have my own issues, as do we all. But to assert that because I question and because I try as best as I can to defend the gospel against false traditions, cultural baggage, biases, secret combinations, corruption, sincere mistakes, right? Because I do all those things, to assert that I am on my way out, or that I'm going to be pushed out, or that I'm somehow apostatizing from the faith, could not, from my perspective, be further from the truth. Those people see themselves as defending the status quo, the narratives, right? Defending the matrix, right? There's another example we could do. The machines were defending the matrix, whereas the humans who have been released, right? They're defending humanity. But the people, in fact, one of my favorite scenes in that movie is when Morpheus is walking Neo's scene with the woman in the red dress. And, let's just go ahead and play the clip right here.
The Matrix is a system, Neo. That system is our enemy. But when you're inside, you look around, what do you see? Businessmen, teachers, lawyers, carpenters, the very minds of the people we are trying to save. But until we do, these people are still a part of that system, and that makes them our enemy. You have to understand, most of these people are not ready to be unplugged. And many of them are so inert, so hopelessly dependent on the system, that they will fight to protect it.
So there are people so dependent, so inured by the system that they will fight anyone who tries to liberate them from it. They're defending the system of which upon which they become dependent. Now, ultimately, I think what's going on here, and this is just Connor's, musings, is that we have in our church many people who have superficial testimonies, and superficial testimonies are weak. They're weak. Even if someone had a spiritual experience or they were raised in the church or whatever, if you don't have any level of rational and intellectual grounding in your beliefs, then I think that is a problem. Let me go back and read briefly this quote from Fair, which again I think is spot on. Though rational argument, does not create conviction, the lack of it destroys belief. What seems to be proved may not be embraced, but what no one shows the ability to defend is quickly abandoned. Rational argument does not create belief, but it maintains a climate in which belief may flourish. A spiritual testimony, I contend, is insufficient. We have to know in our heart and our mind. We need the spiritual confirmation, but I think we need some level of rational understanding and context for these things so that when the spiritual stuff fades, as it inevitably does, we have the ability to withstand all of these supposedly, rational and critical arguments that swirl around us. Let's do a few brief examples. So first, we know this one well, Laman and Lemuel, they view an angel. This is 1 Nephi 3. And it came to pass, as they smote us with a rod, behold, an angel of the Lord came and stood before them. And he spake unto them, saying, Why do you smite your younger brother with a rod? Know ye not that the Lord had chosen him to be a ruler over you, and this because of your iniquities? Behold, ye shall go up to Jerusalem again. The Lord will deliver Laban into your hands. They also, as it says in 1 Nephi 17, had heard the Lord's voice, right? You're swift to do iniquity, but slow to remember the Lord your God. You've seen an angel, and he spake unto you. Yea, you've heard his voice from time to time. And yet, as we well know, Laman and Lemuel, though for them the spiritual experiences were insufficient. It wasn't enough. These powerful witnesses, right? But they didn't have that kind of underlying belief. They had issues that they had to deal with where the spiritual element was insufficient. Nephites, during Nephi and Lehi's time, these are Helaman's sons, thousands of Nephites convert due to the preaching of Nephi and Lehi. This is in Helaman 5, verse 50. It came to pass that they did go forth and did minister unto the people, declaring throughout all the regions round about all the things which they had heard and seen, insomuch that the more part of the Lamanites were convinced of them because of the greatness of the evidences which they had received. And yet, just a few verses later, in the next chapter, chapter 6, we read that they soon fell back into pride and wickedness. Here's a couple verses. And now behold, he had got great hold upon the hearts of the Nephites, yea, insomuch that they become exceedingly wicked. Yea, the more part of them had turned out of the way of righteousness, and did trample under their feet the commandments of God, and did turn unto their own ways, and did build up unto themselves idols of their gold and their silver. And it came to pass that all these iniquities did come unto them in the space of not many years. Or remember, finally, the story from Samuel the Lamanite. Nephites were witnessing great signs and wonders that had been prophesied by Samuel. This is 3 Nephi 1. For example, that when the sun would set, right, and it wouldn't get dark outside, it would continue to be light during the night, and then a new star would appear. That would be the sign that, Christ has come. And despite these signs, again and again, many of them, the people returned to their pride and to their wickedness. And that prompted widespread destruction before the Savior's visit. Here's chapter 2. And the people began to forget those signs and wonders which they had heard, and began to be less and less astonished at a sign or a wonder from heaven, insomuch that they began to be hard in their hearts, and blind in their minds, and began to disbelieve all which they had heard and seen, imagining up some vain thing in their hearts, that it was wrought by men, and by the power of the devil, to lead away and deceive the hearts of the people. And thus did Satan get possession of the hearts of the people again, insomuch that he did blind their eyes and lead them away to believe that the doctrine of Christ was a foolish and a vain thing. I don't think we are immune from these trends. I don't think focusing on spiritual, dopamine hits is sufficient. And I could be totally wrong in this. I could be out in the night, Connor's, over here, a minority, whatever, right? I'm fine with that. I'm a libertarian. I'm usually in the minority. I'm used to it. But I think I'm right. I think that we do need rational argument, both against the church's external critics, but even against trying to assess what's happening within our church and its history and its culture and its current practices, so that we can maintain the integrity of the gospel, that we can remain fixated on what God actually wants us to do, and not fall into the traditions of men and the practices of generations long past, where we adopt the slow stain of the world, where we embrace attitudes and beliefs and traditions and practices that are inconsistent with the gospel, and yet we convince ourselves that it's fine, that we have our summer cottage in Babylon, that we can serve two masters, or that we aren't really actually serving two masters when in fact we are. Ephesians 4 says in verse 14 that we henceforth be no more children, tossed to and fro, and carried about with every wind of doctrine by the sleight of men and cunning craftiness, whereby they lie in wait to deceive. Carried about by every wind of doctrine, that is such a great visualization of, from my perspective, what is happening, where, oh, low here and low there, the CES letter here, and the gospel topic essays there, and polygamy over there, and all these things where people have not studied. They have not really given this context. They have not understand the rational basis for a testimony in the restored gospel of the church, that they just accept narratives. They believe what they read. They believe what they're told, and that's enough. And they latch onto that, and they just throw away the baby with the bathwater, and they leave the church, or they go inactive, or they, whatever, right? Again and again, I think we see the sleight of men, cunning craftiness, lying in wait to deceive, that people get carried about with every wind of doctrine. And yes, I think a big part of that is being spiritually firmly planted, right, on the rock of Christ, so that you're not carried about with every wind of doctrine. But I think rational argument and reviewing things, being critical in a faithful way, defending the gospel against its internal corruption or the potential thereof, is as important. Because then, if not, we start to embrace these kind of false ideas and traditions if we don't have that rational element to go alongside our spiritual highs and dopamine hits that inevitably fade over time. I'm going to wrap up with a few verses in section 112 of the Doctrine and Covenants. This has been sticking in my mind recently as I've been giving this topic some thought. Verses 24 through 26. Behold, vengeance cometh speedily upon the inhabitants of the earth, a day of wrath, a day of burning, a day of desolation, of weeping, mourning, lamentation. And as a whirlwind it shall come upon all the face of the earth, saith the Lord. And upon my house shall it begin, and from my house shall it go forth, saith the Lord. First among those among you, saith the Lord, who have professed to know my name, and have not known me, and have blasphemed against me in the midst of my house, saith the Lord. Now, it's very easy to point the finger elsewhere and to think, okay, the people who are blaspheming, it's person X or group Y or whatever, right? And to kind of compartmentalize and think, I'm doing fine, that doesn't refer to me. I think a far better model is what happened with Christ's apostles when he said, one of you is going to betray me. This is, I believe it was the Last Supper was the scene for this. One of you are going to betray me. And they didn't point fingers. The response was very interesting, right? Instead it was, Lord, is it I? Is it me? Right? Am I guilty of this? Am I going to do that? And I think, as we think about here, upon my house shall it begin, and from my house shall it go forth, first among those who profess to know my name and have not known me. I think we need to question ourselves. We need to question whether what we're doing, whether what we're told to do is correct, is truly in line with the gospel, or if we and collectively the church, including the leaders who have risen up out of the church, have embraced things that we ought not. That we've accommodated things that we ought not. If we've justified and excused things that we ought not. And you and I might have disagreements on what and when and why and how and all the things. I'm not saying that I have all the answers. But I do believe that if we don't have that rational self-reflection and self-criticism, and here by self I mean of our own church community and our traditions and our beliefs, that we will fall prey to what happens in the past. Here Christ says it. It's not going to be, hey, everything's hunky-dory. It's going to be that there is a core element here. There's the wheat, but there are a lot of tares within the church. That the Lord's vengeance in the latter days is not going to start in some far-flung area of the world. It's going to start upon my house. Whether we're talking, Utah as a headquarters of the church or somehow otherwise focused on church members, I don't know. But he's very clear in saying, upon my house shall it begin, and from my house shall it go forth. Why? Because there are many among us in our church who have professed to know God's name but have not known him and have been blaspheming him. And I don't think this is a minor thing. I don't think it's, there's some irreverent people that use the Lord's name in vain, or whatever, right? Like, I don't think this is some minor thing. I think this is a very substantive thing. I think there are a lot of people, potentially even myself, again, Lord is it I, who would be classified as tares. We all think that we're the virgins waiting for the bridegroom, and yet what happened? There were foolish virgins who had deluded themselves into thinking that they were sufficiently prepared or that they could quickly get the oil that they needed, right? But then the Lord shows up after they go to the market and they try to get the oil, and they come back and they knock at the door, and the Lord says, I don't know who you are. I never knew you, right? And yet these virgins, they were waiting. They were good members of the church. They were doing what they were told. They were where they needed to be, but they didn't have the requisite preparations and mindset and practices, right? And so how does that apply to us? Does it apply to us? I think it does. And I think we are just as susceptible as all of God's chosen people throughout scriptural history of abandoning the faith while thinking that we're still faithful. Here the Pharisees, as an example, get rebuked again and again for how far they had deviated from the gospel, deviated from the purpose and the intent behind the law of Moses. And yet they had deluded themselves over years into thinking that their interpretation, their practices, their system was exactly what Moses and God intended. We're not immune from that. And so, sure, I get it. For the perhaps minority of you out there listening to my musings, it's uncomfortable because our culture has cultivated a habit of don't ask questions, don't challenge, follow the prophet, do what we're told, it's all from God. And I don't accept that. I don't believe it's true. Church leaders themselves have said that's not true. I think that is part of the problem. And when I poke at that, again, from a faithful perspective, I try to do so respectfully. I'm not perfect, but that's my intent. That can be very uncomfortable for people. And I get it. I was there, right? I understand. But I think it's important. I don't want, when that vengeance comes upon the house of the Lord, I don't want to be found amongst those who profess to know God's name but have not known him. I don't want to be carried about with every wind of doctrine, right? I don't want to be like the wicked Nephites or like Laman and Lemuel and all these people who have spiritual experiences, but they don't stay grounded. Because especially with social media, especially with just, the internet and all these ideas and all these claims and all these historical whatever, right? It's so easy for people to be insufficiently prepared for those onslaughts to come. And if they can't defend through rational argument what appears to be a very rational argument, they're persuaded by it, even though it's wrong. And if only they had a rational foundation to support their spiritual experiences, again, the rationality is not going to further testimony, but it maintains a climate in which a testimony may flourish. I believe in the gospel. I believe that God restored it to Joseph Smith. But I also believe Joseph when he says that every time he tried to introduce a new doctrine or an idea, the saints would fly to pieces like glass. I believe that we as human beings are very susceptible to adopting that slow stain of the world and convincing ourselves into thinking that we're righteous and on that straight and narrow when perhaps we are not. Abundant examples exist, and I've only scratched the surface. So many more are in the scriptures, you know them. I don't want to fall into that. I don't want to pat ourselves on the back, think all is well in Zion, trust the leaders, they know what's right, prophets see around corners, let's just keep doing, what we're told. No, I don't think that's what we should be doing at all. I think God gave us brains for a reason. I think we can challenge and question and have curiosities and musings from a respectful, faithful perspective. And I get that it's going to be uncomfortable for people who say, well, that's interesting, but not inspiring, right? My goal not necessarily is to inspire you. It's to provoke conversation and thoughtfulness so that you and I can have a rational foundation to support the flourishing of a testimony that can withstand when the spiritual stuff fades away a little bit and when the onslaught of claims and ideas and perspectives and arguments come at us. I've seen many people leave the church and abandon their faith, and I think that's wrong, and I think that's lamentable, and I think much of it could have been avoided. And I want that for myself. I want that for my kids. I want that for you. I don't want to see people abandoning the gospel. I want to see us deviate from the scriptural trend of this kind of spiritual degradation. I want to be the exception. I want the latter-day dispensation to break free from this trend, but I fear that that's just not the case. And therefore, there are tares amongst us. There are people amongst us who profess to know God, and I don't think church leadership is immune from that. I don't think we have some magical, exception to historical trends. So I am, for my part, going to continue as best as I see it to defend the restoration, the restored gospel from ideas and concepts and traditions and idolatry and whatever that I believe is leading people away from the gospel. Now, again, defense is relative. Other people are often going to perceive that they're defending, the established narrative and church historians and church leaders and, whatever, right? And that's fine. Defense is relative. They have their perspective. I have mine. So to those of you who have a hard time with questions and deviations from kind of the cultural norm and what we've all been told we ought to do, maybe this podcast isn't for you. But I can't tell you how many people I've got private messages from who don't feel comfortable sharing this type of stuff online, who express gratitude for helping them develop that rational foundation, helping them see that we can thoughtfully analyze and even criticize things that happen within our own church, but that doing so does not mean that it's all wrong or that leaders are just malicious and doing the wrong things intentionally, right? That we can thread the needle of saying the gospel was restored, imperfect men were put in charge, imperfect people make mistakes. There are mistakes historically, there are mistakes presently. We can give grace and create an environment in which those mistakes can happen while simultaneously the gospel remains true, even if many amongst us are abandoning it by adopting the slow stain of the world, right? We don't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater. We don't have to avoid criticism because it makes us uncomfortable. I think we can, have our cake here and eat it too. I think we can have a spiritual and a rational foundation. I think they're complementary. They are for me. So maybe I'm just wired differently than many of you. That's also fine too. But I hope that, like the people who DM me privately, that you're gaining something here, that you see that from my vantage point, I'm trying to defend the gospel. My heart's in the right place. I'm very committed to the gospel. And I have this high sensitivity, I feel like, to internal issues that I feel like we don't talk about enough. I think that's part of the problem. If we don't pay attention to the internal problems, they fester and they spread like a cancer. And I see few voices out there who are willing to point out internal issues. Instead, it's circle the wagons, don't say anything inconvenient or awkward or unflattering or critical, right? Instead, let's just go promote the gospel and let's push back against external threats and claims. And that has its place. But if the cancer grows, right, then the host is threatened. Then we lose the host. I don't want to lose the host. I don't want calamities to happen to most of us. It's going to happen to some of us. The tares are amongst the wheat. I want to be the wheat. I think I need to constantly ask, Lord, am I a tare? Am I wheat? How am I doing? What can I be doing differently? And for me, these musings are part of that. So who are we defending the gospel against? It's against everybody. It's against external threats. It's against internal threats. It's against our own temptations and, periodic apostasy. It's against Satan. we have to be on guard. By no means am I perfect, but this is an avenue, a vehicle through which I try to express my thoughts and my curiosities and my questions and my beliefs that can at least foster a discussion on, hey, have we deviated a little bit here? Is there a way to get back to at least what I perceive to be the kind of core focus and intent of what God revealed with the gospel? Let me know in the comments what you think. This is a subject that I know many people feel strongly about. Many people have their opinions of me and about people like me who take this type of position, and they just think that, oh, it's only inevitable, at this stage that you're going to leave or they're going to kick you out, right? That becomes the very kind of easy way to just dispense with people who are asking questions and who are expressing concerns. But I think that's unhelpful. And I know it's unhelpful because I know how many people my questions and musings and thoughts have helped. So I'm going to keep doing it. I feel that I'm supposed to. I feel that I've been given a certain gift of research and analytical mind, and that I've kind of fallen into this opportunity to be sharing these ideas. So maybe they are beneficial to you. I hope they are. And maybe that's where I'll end. If they are helpful to you, I'd always appreciate if you go to the Apple Podcasts app and leave your review there. Help other people find it that way. Or like, comment, share on YouTube, where I'm trying to build things up. I'm thinking about going to Rumble because YouTube's a bunch of authoritarian censors, and it's probably, in fact, they banned one of my videos like a year ago, and then I was on Michelle, Michelle, the 132 podcast. I know her name. She's a friend. Her name isn't popping in my head for some reason, but I was on her podcast, and then YouTube banned that one because we don't even know why. Like, we talked about cannabis a little bit and other, I don't know. So maybe I'll end up on Rumble eventually. But for now, leave a comment, share the video, leave a review if you would, if you enjoy these musings. I'm always open, by the way, to ideas. I've got a long list of other stuff I want to cover. But if you have ideas, questions you're struggling with, thoughts that you've been having, feel free to shoot me a DM on your preferred social platform. And I always love and appreciate your feedback and your comments. I'll see you next Sunday.